Okay, we're going to the next chapter of the problem of political authority. And I don't know if I need to hit reverse on the image. I see it showing up backwards on my screen, but I suppose it doesn't really matter. So we're on chapter, I believe, 2, which is the traditional social contract theory. And this is a fantastic chapter. And again, as usual, there's going to be quite a bit of reading because he's a very good author. But I've distilled it down. So, the intro, 2.1, the social contract orthodoxy. It says the social contract theory is the most prominent account of authority in the last 400 years of philosophy and has as good a claim as any to being America's theory of authority. The theory holds that, at least in some countries, there is a contractual relationship between the government and its citizens. The contract requires the government to provide certain services for the population, notably protection from private criminals and hostile foreign governments. In return, citizens agree to pay their taxes and obey the laws. Some views of the social contract assign the government a larger role, perhaps including providing for the basic needs of indigent citizens, ensuring an equitable distribution of material resources, and so on. Whatever a particular theorist takes to be the state's legitimate functions, the theorist will argue that the social contract both authorizes and obligates the state to perform those functions. And then it goes on to recognize that the state is coercion, but says, and I would agree with this, if a person agrees to be subjected to a particular form of coercion, then as a rule, that coercion will not be wrong and will not violate his rights. Now, interesting, there's a footnote here, and this is what I've more commonly heard, and I'm sure he might get into this later on in the book, but it says Hobbes claims that the state owes nothing to the citizens because the state is not a party to the contract. Instead, he takes the social contract as an agreement among citizens. And that's what I've most commonly heard. Haven't heard it cogently argued for. But the people I've dealt with seem to have made that particular assumption, that there's like this societal mutual obligation. So 2.2, the explicit social contract theory goes, is there a social contract? At first glance, the theory exhibits an impudent disregard for reality. No one has been presented with a contract describing how the government operates and asked for a signature. It says, when do the social contract theorists think this event happened? Locke believed that it worked through a perpetual restrictive covenant on the land. The original contractors committed all their possessions, including their land, to the jurisdiction of the government that they were creating, so that any person to ever use that land in the future would be required to submit to that government. There's a footnote here I'm going to read, and then I'm going to do some commentary. It says, an interesting question remains as to whether citizens might later withdraw their consent, as one may typically withdraw consent to other forms of coercion. I need to do more thinking on this. Now, he goes on to say that this isn't the popular theory today, and there's no evidence of that. If you're going to place such a restriction, it needs to be in writing and needs to be explicitly agreed to in title transfer of the land, if such a thing as a perpetual contract upon land is binding. I need to do more thought on this, though I've done quite a bit because I used to work in homeowners association law many, many moons ago. But I'm more and more beginning to believe, like, I know libertarians like to go, oh, without zoning regulations, you could always just move into a homeowners association. I'm highly doubtful that, I don't believe corporations are a legitimate libertarian form, so that's a whole other thing, because a homeowners association is a corporation. However, let's put that aside for now. I don't think you can bind land perpetually. There's some kind of weird, that's almost like a social contract theory in a way, where you're entering into this agreement that other people are entering into with the knowledge that everyone else is, to put, again, perpetual restrictions on the land. I just don't think the dead hand of the past can bind the future in that way. And I understand that people say, well, it's renewed with each title transfer, so it's not the past, it becomes the present. But it's impossible to transfer the land without that. And I don't think you can have some kind of use restriction on the land unless somebody owns that use restriction. Who owns it? The homeowners association? Because then they have to be responsible for liability that might come from it. And for liability onto the use of the land, like it's almost a co-ownership situation. So I need to do a lot more thought in this and read a lot more libertarian legal theorists on this. But I'm beginning to severely doubt in Libertopia, at least what we would know as a modern homeowners association would exist. Now, I do think you can have, obviously, contractual arrangements with your neighbors, but I don't think they adhere to the land. I think they adhere to the person. It can get quite complex, but let's move on. It says, David Hume painted the more realistic picture of human history when he observed that nearly all governments are founded on usurpation or conquest. Right, they weren't all founded on just peaceful homesteading of the land in which they can put these little restrictions on it. It said, this would invalidate the state's authority on a Lockean view. But, he says, no prominent contemporary theorist endorses the explicit social contract theory. And I don't even think the explicit social contract theory is explicit. I don't think alleged perpetual covenant running with the land is explicit. And then 2.3, the implicit social contract theory. Explicit consent is consent that one indicates by stating, either verbally or in writing, that one consents. By contrast, implicit consent is consent that one indicates through one's conduct without actually stating one's agreement. If citizens have not embraced a social contract explicitly, perhaps they have embraced it implicitly. You've got high burdens of proof with implicit contracts. They do exist, however. So, for instance, he says, it's plausible. So he gives this example that he's going to keep referring to, so I want to read it. It says, suppose you are in a board meeting where the chairman says, next week's meeting will be moved to Tuesday at 10 o'clock. Any objections? He pauses and no one says anything. Good, it's agreed, the chairman concludes. In this situation, it's plausible that the board's failure to express dissent when invited to do so indicates that the board members consent to the change. That would be passive consent. It says, in other cases, one commits oneself to accepting demands by soliciting or voluntarily accepting benefits to which those demands are known to be attached. Now, this is what a lot of people will ride upon today. Well, you live on roads, you accept electricity. He's going to deal with that. He says, I call this consent through acceptance of benefits. For example, suppose you enter a restaurant and order a nice, tasty veggie wrap. After you eat the wrap, the waitress brings the check. What's this, you say? I never said I was going to pay for any of this. If you wanted payment, you should have said so at the start. I'm sorry, but I don't owe you anything. In this case, the restaurant could plausibly argue that by ordering the food, you implicitly indicated agreement with the usual demand connected with the provision of that food, namely payment of the price mentioned on the menu. Okay, that's reasonable. He says a third form of implicit consent is what I call consent through presence, where one indicates agreement to a proposal merely by remaining in the same location. And he gives an example of, let me just read his example because this might come up later. While having a party at my house, I announce loudly and clearly to everyone present that anyone who wants to stay at my party must agree to help clean up afterwards. After hearing my announcement, you carry on partying. In doing so, you imply that you agree to help clean up at the end. It says, finally, sometimes one implicitly consents to the rules governing a practice by voluntarily participating in the practice. I call this consent through participation, and we've all heard that today. It goes, if you vote, you consent. All right. And then he's going to go to examine these. He says, perhaps citizens typically consent to the social contract merely by refraining from objecting to it. Passive consent. And I love these next few sentences. Just as few, if any of us, have ever explicitly stated that we accept the social contract, few have ever stated that we do not accept it. And then here's the parenthetical that I love. The exceptions are anarchists who have explicitly stated their rejection of government. Let's consider next the case of consent through presence. This, in my experience, is the most popular theory of how citizens give their consent to the state, perhaps because it's the only account that can be applied to everyone within the state's territory. Because, he'll give examples of, well, what if you didn't accept any benefits? What if you're an anarchist who said, I reject government, but yet you stayed here? I've had that argument used against me before. I just never found it even persuasive enough to spend a lot of time, refuting it. To me, it's self-evidently ridiculous. It's like saying, well, you could always move out of Hell's Kitchen if you don't want the mob to, extort you for protection money. So, 2.4, conditions for valid agreements. He says, the following are 4 plausible general principles governing valid agreements. And, of course, there's a lot more explanation. I'm giving you the surface level and just giving you my thoughts. Number 1, valid consent requires a reasonable way of opting out. And then he gives an example of the boardroom again. So, a modification of it. He says, the chairman says next week's meeting will be moved to Tuesday at 10 o'clock. Those who object will kindly signal this objection by cutting off their left arm. The chairman pauses. No arms come off. Good, it's agreed, he declares. This is not a valid agreement because the demand that board members give up their left arms as the price of dissenting from the schedule change is unreasonable. On the other hand, in his home party example, the demand that you leave my party if you do not agree to clean up is reasonable because I have the right to determine who will attend my parties. The important difference between the modified boardroom example and the party example is not a matter of how large the costs are. That is, it is not simply that losing your left arm is much worse than being expelled from a party. The chairman would not be justified even in demanding that board members pay $1 to express their objection to the schedule change. And there's a nuance here that is so good. Rather, it is a matter of who has rights over the good that dissenters are asked to give up. Those who seek your agreement to some proposal may not demand that you give up any of your rights as the cost of rejecting that proposal. I may demand that you give up use of my property if you don't accept some proposal of mine, but I may not demand that you give up use of your property. That's very powerful. Number 2, explicit dissent trumps alleged implicit consent. Number 3, an action can be taken as indicating agreement to some scheme only if one can be assumed to believe that if one did not take that action, the scheme would not be imposed on one. So he gives the boardroom example again. Well, before we get to that, for number 2, explicit dissent trumps alleged implicit consent, he gives a modified restaurant example. He says, suppose you tell the waitress after being seated that I will not pay for any food you bring me, but I'd like you to bring me a veggie wrap anyway. If the waitress then brings you the wrap, you're not obligated to pay for it. She cannot plausibly claim that you agreed to pay for the meal after your explicit dissent. Okay, so now going back to number 3, which I'll reread because it's like a mouthful that even when I read it, I'm like, what are you trying to say here? An action can be taken as indicating agreement to some scheme, only if one can be assumed to believe that if one did not take that action, the scheme would not be imposed upon one. He goes, suppose in the board meeting example, the chairman says next week's meeting will be moved to Tuesday at 10 o'clock, and I don't care what any of you have to say about it. The schedule change will happen whether you object to it or not. Now, does anyone object? He pauses. No one says anything. Good, it's agreed, he declared. In this case, there's no valid agreement. Though the board members were given a chance to object, they were also given to understand if they objected, the schedule change would be imposed anyway. Their failure to express objections, therefore, cannot be taken to indicate agreement. Okay, the example's clear. The way he worded the summary statement isn't. Then number 4, contractual obligation is mutual and conditional. So it says, like, if you go to the restaurant, you order the food, but you never get it, then you can't be expected to pay for it. It says these 4 conditions belong to the common sense conception of consent and contracts. And he goes, then he'll apply those principles to the putative social contract. Okay, that's all I'm going to record for tonight because we're already over 15 minutes. I'm going to upload, obviously, the entire summary, but I'm just going to record it over several days, so you'll see a costume change. All right, yeah, as you can tell, it is the next day now, and we're continuing. So we have 2.5 is the social contract ballad, where Professor Humer is going to be going through each of those 4 conditions very briefly. So, first condition, the difficulty of opting out. Begin with the first condition on valid agreements. All parties to a contract must have a reasonable way of opting out. What are the available means of opting out of the social contract? There is only one. One must vacate the territory controlled by the state. And, again, I'm skipping around because I'm giving you the highlights. He says, if one moves to another country, one will merely become subject to another government. What should one do if one does not wish to consent to any government? I realize I do this a lot in my writing style, and I understand you need to, this whole one. I prefer the more casual you, but yeah, I get it. Those seeking to avoid all governmental jurisdiction have 3 options. They may live in the ocean, move to Antarctica, or commit suicide. No thanks. I'll pass. It says, in the words of David Hume, we may as well assert that a man, by remaining in a vessel, freely consents to the dominion of the master, though he was carried on board while asleep, and must leap into the ocean and perish the moment he leaves her. All right, it says, however, this is not even the primary issue. The primary issue is whether one is being asked to give up something to which one has a right, as the price of rejecting the social contract. This certainly seems to be the case. If a board chairman cannot demand that board members pay him $1 to express dissent from a proposed schedule change, how can someone be required to give up home and job and leave all friends and family behind to express disagreement with a contract? Here is one answer. Perhaps the state owns all the territory over which it claims jurisdiction. So this is kind of going back to that covenant with the land, but a little bit of a different spin. Instead of saying that you own it, you're just subject to a restrictive covenant. It's saying, no, you don't even own it. The state does. Thus, just as I may expel people from my house if they do not agree to help clean up at the end of the party, the state may expel people from its territory if they do not agree to obey the laws and pay taxes. Even if we grant that the state owns its territory, it is debatable whether it may expel people who reject the social contract. Compare the following. If anyone who leaves my party before it is over is doomed to die, one might think I lose the right to kick people out of my party. Now, I know there are some really strict libertarian theorists who will say that, and I don't believe that. I think the non-aggression principle, the right to property, also entails the minimization of harm and that sort of thing. Now, if the person came to your party and you started the party knowing that you were fickle and can make all these demands or throw people out, and throwing people out would be death, and they entered voluntarily on those conditions, well, I think the person entering is crazy, and you're a psycho as well, probably a sociopath. That'd be a different story. But if you just sprung this on somebody and it's not a reasonable expectation of going to the party, then no, you don't have the right to throw them out if they're going to die. You have the responsibility as someone who let them onto your property to address reasonably expected safe egress. It says, might does not make right, and the mere fact that the state exercises power over the people in a region does not give the state a property right, nor any other kind of right in all the land within that region. Agreed. Though some people seem to think it does. If we do not assume that the state already has authority, then it is very difficult to see how the state can claim title to all the land of its citizens. And I like this, and if we must assume the state already has authority, then we don't need the social contract theory. Chapter 1 included a story in which you take to punishing vandals and extorting payment for your services from the rest of your village. Imagine that when you show up at your neighbor's door to collect payment, your neighbor protests that he never agreed to pay for your crime prevention services. Au contraire, you respond. You have agreed because you are living in your house. If you do not wish to pay me, you must leave your house. Is this a reasonable demand? Does your neighbor's failure to leave his house show that he is obligated to pay you? Unless the government really owns all the land that, as we usually say, its citizens own. I'm looking for how far this chapter goes because I'm looking to see if I can do it in this last sitting. The government would be in the same position as you in that example. It may not demand that individuals stop using their own property, nor may it set the conditions under which individuals may continue to occupy their own land, even though it does, with property taxes and the like. I conclude that the first condition on valid contracts is violated by the social contract. Second condition, the failure to recognize explicit dissent. Let's turn to the second condition. You have not implicitly accepted a contract if you explicitly state that you do not accept it. In the case of the social contract, a small number of people have explicitly indicated their disagreement. These are the political anarchists, people who hold there should be no government. Yet every government continues to impose laws and taxes on anarchists. They certainly do. However vociferously you might protest against the social contract, the government will not refund your tax money nor exempt you from the laws. Yeah. Number 3, unconditional imposition. The third principle about valid agreements was that an action can be taken as a person's agreement to some scheme only if a person can reasonably be assumed that if he didn't take that action, the scheme would not be imposed upon him. This rules out nearly all the ways in which citizens are said to implicitly accept the social contract. Almost everyone knows that the state will still impose the same laws and same taxes on one, regardless of whether one objects to the government, accepts government services, or participates in the political process. Therefore, one's failure to object, one's acceptance of government services, and even one's participation in the political process cannot be taken to imply agreement on the social contract. That is a really powerful point, and I didn't really grok the strength of it even on first read until I was reading it out loud here. Reading things and hearing things, enters, I think, a different area of your brain. The one form of implicit consent not ruled out through this principle is consent through presence. If you cease to reside in the territory controlled by the state, then and only then will the state cease to impose its laws upon you. That is not true. Unless you renounce your citizenship, you're still responsible, say, for income taxes and the like, from what I understand, even if you're earning income abroad. Unlike the other alleged ways of implicitly consenting to be governed, remaining present in the state's territory really is a condition of having the state's laws imposed upon you. No, and if you've committed some kind of crime against the state here, a victimless crime, you could still have them imposed upon you elsewhere, where they can collect you, which is having it imposed upon you and send you back. Thus, only consent through presence, in some circumstances, satisfies the third principle about valid agreements. The idea of consent through presence, however, has been rejected above on other grounds. Okay, the last and fourth principle. The absence of mutual obligation. A contract imposes mutual obligations on the parties, with each party's obligation conditional on the other party's acceptance of its obligation. It says the state is supposed to assume an obligation to the citizen to enforce their rights, including protecting the citizen from criminals and hostile foreign governments. Does the state ever fail in this duty? Yep. What happens when it does? In one sense, the state fails all the time. In any large society, thousands or millions of citizens are victimized each year by crimes that the state failed to prevent. But it would be unreasonable to expect the state to prevent all crimes. Perhaps the social contract only requires the state to make a reasonable effort to prevent crimes. But what if the state fails to do even that? And then it goes to give the history of how the courts have held that the government owes no duty to protect citizens. And then it goes on to say, if the contract somehow only holds between the state and the public at large, and not any individual citizen, then perhaps the public at large owes something to the state, but no individual would. And then he closes. My claim in this section has not been that most people would not agree to have a government. My claim is that there is, in fact, no valid agreement. Perhaps you would have accepted the social contract if you had been given a choice, but you were not. This makes your relationship with the government a non-voluntary, non-contractual one, regardless of whether you are actually happy with the relationship. Nor do I claim that all non-voluntary relationships are morally illegitimate or unjust. The point is simply that the social contract theory is false because it depicts a non-voluntary relationship as voluntary. The central moral premise of the traditional social contract theory is commendable. Human action should be carried out as far as possible on a voluntary basis. But the central factual premise flies in the face of reality, whatever else might be said about it. Subjection to government is obviously not voluntary. In modern times, every human being is born under this subjection. Ugh, that's so depressing. And will die under it. And has no practical means of escaping it. All right, that is it for that chapter. The next chapter will be chapter 3, the hypothetical social contract theory. We always look at how many pages the next chapter is. This one seems to be a little bit longer. It is just over 20 pages. How long was the prior one? I thought it was more like 10. It was just over 10. So the next one's a bit longer. Probably take 3 sections like this to, or maybe even 4, to go through it when we do. But until then,